I'm Angeline Trevanna. I am an indie author writing dystopian urban fantasy and post-apocalyptic fiction. I've been writing since I was old enough to hold a pen, and I've been indie publishing for 6 years. I am a total world building nerd, and I tend to get very excited over some very odd little things, as you'll probably find out as we go along. And I'll just quickly say that as we're recording this, I am currently away on holiday, so I don't actually have my proper recording set up with me. So the sound might be a little iffy, so I'm sorry about that, but see how dedicated I am on holiday.
And my audio should be okay, touch wood. I am HB Lyne, and I write dark urban fantasy, and I've been an indie author since 2013. Like Angeline, I've been writing for as long as I can remember, and from a young age, I was drawn to fantasy stories with rich worlds like Narnia and Lord of the Rings. Later, I got really into role-playing and loved immersing myself in the worlds of games such as Dungeons and Dragons and The World of Darkness. Together, we co-host the Great Western Woods World Building podcast. Welcome to our World Build Like a Pro presentation for the Alliance of Independent Authors Conference.
So this is going to be a sort of like a whistle-stop tour on world building, because we could very easily create like a year-long course on this. It is such a big subject with so much to talk about, but we don't have that long.
No, we don't. So sit back and relax, but don't forget to grab a notebook. If you get any inspiration for the world you're currently building or one you're planning on building, or get an entirely new idea, just go ahead and scribble them down. We hope that this will inspire you.
So world building is the creation of the fictional world in which your story exists, or the creation of fictional elements in a real life setting. Because while world building may always be associated with fantasy, world building happens and is important to every genre, although to different extents.
Yeah, and the reason world building is important, even in real life settings, is to create a place that your readers can really immerse themselves in, a place they can truly believe in and feel like they're walking around in. We spend a lot of time and effort making our characters believable and relatable, and they deserve a believable world to walk around in.
Now, there are a few different ways in which you can approach your world building. You might be looking to create a whole new fictional world. So this is when you're creating an entirely fictional world from scratch, a place that does not and never has really existed. So something like Middle-earth or Narnia. This is, of course, common in epic fantasy and also science fiction, which it might actually be set in our universe, but be taking place on imagined planets beyond our solar system.
Another approach is to build within a real place, but to give it either an alternate past or future. This is something that's very common in dystopia. You take a real existing place, say London, and put it into an alternate past. For example, if the Great Fire of London was actually started by dragons, or you give it a possible future. So your basic map is largely done for you, but there's likely to be differences, like some famous landmarks are missing, or place names may have changed, things like that.
Or you might want to build a parallel fantasy world that exists alongside the real one. So our world with a paranormal fantasy secondary world or subculture, which is usually invisible or secret or hidden from the general public. Something like Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere or Harry Potter or Hellboy. This is found in portal fantasy, which, strictly speaking, Narnia actually is, because characters from our world step through a portal into Narnia. And it's also common in urban fantasy, although urban fantasy can also take place in an entire fantasy world of its own.
But whichever kind of world you're building, your objective is still the same: to create a believable world that your readers can really imagine walking around in. Because when we write, we want our readers to be immersed, to keep turning the page. And that's why we have to do world building, because it's the hows and the whys that make your world believable, even if they never make it into the actual story.
And world building isn't exclusive to the fantasy and sci-fi genres. Every genre requires at least a little world building. So even if you're writing contemporary fiction set in the town that you live in, there are still fictional elements to be put in: characters, locations, events. Every genre of fiction requires world building, but the heavy lifting, the creation of entire worlds, tends to be done by fantasy and sci-fi writers, and by horror writers too. But if you don't write any of those genres, you will still find useful things in here. So do stick around with us.
Starting to world build can be a little bit like starting a new story without a plot. There's that big blank page to tackle. And if it's your first go at world building, or at least world building on a big scale, it can be a little daunting. It can be hard to know where to start.
And I don't know about you, Holly, but I am one of those people who, if I don't know where to start, I tend to get overwhelmed and not bother starting at all. And actually, there's no hard and fast rule here either. If you think about where your story ideas come from, and I mean that very initial flash of inspiration, it probably comes from different places. Sometimes it's a character, sometimes a snippet of dialogue, sometimes a location or a small section of plot. And world building can grow out of any of these things.
It's perfectly all right to come up with a character and then build a world for them to live in, just as it's fine to create the world first and then to populate it with characters, or to start with a historical event or a landmark somewhere on your map. Whatever it is that kicks off your world idea, that's absolutely fine, so run with it.
A really good thing to start with, or at least to decide nice and early on, is your genre. Are you writing epic fantasy or dystopia or space opera or urban fantasy? This will have a bearing on what kind of world you're building and also how much of it you need to build. For example, if you're writing space opera, you may well be world building an entire galaxy, or, of course, just a single spaceship. If you're writing urban fantasy, you might only need to map out a single city or even just part of that city. If you're writing epic fantasy, well, the clue's kind of in the name there, so you're likely to need an entire world.
Your chosen genre will also give you a lot of other pointers about the amount and the kind of world building that you're going to need to do. Things like, will you need to build a magic system? Will you need to invent futuristic weapons? Are there monsters, or a long detailed history, or complex government structures? Yes, your genre will determine a lot of things about your world.
So one of my absolute favorite parts of world building is making the map. And you do not need to be an amazing artist. Honestly, a childlike scrawl on the back of an envelope is good enough as long as it makes sense to you so that you don't end up getting lost in your own world, which is actually surprisingly easy, because if your characters are traveling from A to B and 1 minute B is west of A, then it's suddenly south, or if B is a coastal town 1 minute and a village in the mountains the next, your readers will notice and it will drag them out of your story.
Also, you can't simply draw a map and then randomly scatter towns across it. That doesn't happen. You have to keep going back to your whys. Whatever you're creating, keep asking yourself, why? Why do people live here? What made them choose this place rather than that place over there?
So imagine you're choosing a place to establish a town. What do you need? What considerations do you need to make? A source of fresh water will always be the first consideration. Have you ever noticed how many cities have rivers running through them? Fresh water is essential for life, and it will always be the first thing that people look for when establishing a new settlement. Unless, of course, if you're writing about non-human characters that don't require water to survive. But actually, the same principle will apply whatever their primary life-giving need is. That's the first thing they'll be looking for.
Mhm. Another thing that people will need in a settlement is a varied food source. They need all of the vitamins and nutrients to sustain themselves and keep themselves healthy. They need all of the food groups. So think about where they can hunt for meat, where they can grow vegetables and fruit, where they can fish. They need appropriate land for growing food and for raising animals, whether that be large flat pastures or rocky mountains or floodplains. Whatever is their main farming interest, that's what they need the right kind of land for.
They also need natural resources for building: trees, stone, reeds, mud, clay. They need to be able to build shelters, and they need to be able to make all the things they need to make their lives easier. It's also useful if they can make things that they are able to trade, because no place is perfect. No place is going to give them absolutely everything that they need. They will need to be able to trade for the things they don't have. Now, initially, this will be necessities, but as time goes on, it will be luxuries. So, as they start communicating with other settlements, accepting strangers, and going out exploring other places themselves, you also need to think about access routes to the town. Are there easy paths, good for people, good for horses, good for carts, good for vehicles, good for spaceships? Whatever is the norm in your world. And with the introduction of strangers, they also need to start thinking about security. Is their town easy to defend? Is it easy to spot people approaching?
Another consideration is predators. Are there any wolves in the forest? Are there lions in the mountains? Crocodiles in the river? If there's prey for people to hunt, there are going to be predators. How much of a problem is this going to be for them? How can they protect their children and their animals? When establishing a town, people by and large will choose the easiest option unless the benefits outweigh the dangers or struggles. For example, you might consider it foolish to establish a town in the middle of a dragon breeding ground, but what if just one dragon scale, which could be naturally shed, would sell for a price that could feed your whole family for 3 months? Then it may well be worth it.
Of course, you're not necessarily writing about your world at its very beginnings. You're probably not writing about the first humans to settle. Your world is probably already more mature than that. But when you start placing towns, cities, and villages on your map, you need to keep going back to that why. Why was it established here in the first place? As life evolves, there will be different reasons to stay in a particular place. So a modern city may have been originally established on a river, by a forest with good mining opportunities nearby. But now the river runs deep underground, forgotten by most people. The forest is long gone and the mines have been closed for centuries. But the echoes of those things will remain. A poor part of town that floods once in a while. A park named after the forest that once stood there, or a jewelry quarter where the gems that fetch the highest price were mined locally several generations ago.
Because everything that happens in your world, everything that has ever happened, is like a pebble dropped into a pool. It creates ripples. Sometimes those ripples fade quickly. Sometimes they keep going for centuries, and they keep influencing and affecting the present. So you need to keep thinking about those ripples and those whys. Keep asking yourself, what pebbles have been dropped into the pool?
So along with placing human settlements and civilization onto your map, you also need to map the landscape itself: the rivers, the forests, the plains, the marshes, the mountains, the deserts. Of course, some of these will have been a consideration when you placed your towns and cities, and it can be tempting to just throw everything in there to take your world from sandy beaches in the east to rocky mountains in the west, and just toss in anything and everything in between.
First, make sure you're thinking about the scope of your map. If you're creating an entire world, you most probably will have a bit of everything. But if you're only mapping a single country, it's not so likely. And not every part of your map will require a bit of everything either. You can choose to create a country that's mostly desert, or mostly plains, or mostly mountains. It can be wet and boggy, or dry and rocky, or covered in ice. You don't need to throw everything at it.
And you always need to keep coming back to your whys, because those are the things that make your world real and believable. You don't want to tell your readers that there's a beach here. You want them to feel the gritty sand on their feet. You don't want to tell them about the mountains there. You want them to feel the wind on their face. You want your reader to walk in your world just as you want them to feel everything along with your characters. So, whatever happens, whatever your place in your world needs to make sense in your world. So think, why is there a crater here? What happened when that volcano erupted? Why hasn't this forest been cleared for farmland? Why?
So travel also needs to be a consideration. How people travel and where they travel to and how long it takes them. This will very much depend on the technology available to them. A person on foot is not going to be able to travel as far as someone on a horse, who won't be able to travel as far as someone in a car or an aeroplane or a spaceship. Also, someone on foot won't be able to carry as much. This has a huge impact on the daily lives of your characters. Their world is far smaller than someone who is able to travel further.
If your story sees your characters traveling huge distances, you need to make sure it's actually possible, and you need to know how long it will take them. Also, how much it would cost them. So not everyone would be able to afford to travel. And if you're marching entire armies around your map, someone needs to feed and water them and buy them new boots, not to mention paying their wages. So just be aware of what's possible and what's plausible. If your story requires your characters to visit two different distant places in the space of 2 days, just make sure that they're actually able to.
You can use things like this to highlight the differences and inequalities between the different demographics of people in your world. The differences between the haves and the have-nots, those who can and those who can't. You can also use these things to create conflict, which of course every story needs, but we'll talk more about that later.
There are loads of different ways to name the places on your map. Remember that it's not just towns and cities. So depending on how big your map is, you might be naming mountain ranges, rivers, forests, counties, countries, oceans, continents, or even planets.
Just like places on your map aren't randomly placed, neither are they randomly named. They might be named after their founder, or the landscape, or the natural resources, the wildlife, the river, or the mountain that they're close to. They might be named after a local legend.
Now, I'm a little bit of a word nerd, and I am totally fascinated by the history of names, and also by the way in which they change over time, because they do, for all kinds of reasons. A lot of the time, names change simply through laziness. So consonants get dropped, names are shortened, separate words run together. Place names also change when countries are invaded, or locals might have a different name for a place or a different pronunciation of the name.
It's worthwhile, if you're ever driving somewhere with a sat-nav, to look at the road names as they come up on screen, particularly out in the countryside where there aren't many street signs.
Like I say, I am a total word nerd, and I actually find this game quite sadly exciting. In Devon, one place we lived, there was a country lane there called Coffin Tree Hill, and another called Scratch Face Lane. So just imagine how they got those names. There are so many potential stories there. We also lived near a village called Black Dog. That was named after a local myth. So your place names can conjure up stories of their own.
Yeah, absolutely. My parents live near a village called Willshill. I'd bet my right hand the land used to belong to someone called Will, and everyone called it Will's Hill. This is Yorkshire, so it absolutely would sound like Willshill. Your current world is a product of everything that ever happened there, even if no one in your world still remembers, but it's your job as the writer to know.
Now, we're not saying that you need to plot out 5 million years worth of history, unless you're into that. Some people are. But you definitely need to know enough to understand why things are the way they are. And you need to remember that every time something changes, it affects everything else.
So let's elaborate on that a little. There are different levels at which an event can occur. There are international events. This is something that affects the entire world, like climate change, population explosion, the sun dying, or zombie apocalypse. And then there are national events, things that affect a country or a large area, like an economic crash or natural disaster, the death of a monarch, and so on.
Next, you have local events. Now, these affect a town or a community. This would be events such as a harvest failure or a flood, a local election, or the introduction of a new predator. And finally, at the lowest level, we have individual events affecting one person or a family, things like bereavement, loss of employment, loss of home, births, marriages, etc.
It's obvious how an international event affects everything else. I'm sure a worldwide zombie outbreak would affect you and your family, but what about the other way around? Can an individual event affect a much larger group of people? Does the butterfly effect exist?
It absolutely can. So imagine a family preparing for a wedding. They order a whole load of wine from the next village. That gives the farmer enough money to finally live out his dream of buying a boat and exploring the seas. When the winter rains come, the lack of the vineyard on the hillside causes a landslip, which demolishes the mining town below, which leads to a shortage of minerals, which leads to a shortage of coins, which results in an economic crash.
So it's always important to think about those butterflies and the ripples you might be sending out. And that's in the present and the ripples that the past sends into the future. And you can really have fun with this. You can hide all kinds of references in your world, giving it a beautiful depth and fullness. And you can insert in jokes and Easter eggs, special references that only your biggest fans will notice. This is something that I really enjoy doing.
So you can also use your world building to create conflict. Remember that conflict is created when your protagonist's goal is interrupted or opposed, and you can use your world to do that. Perhaps the most obvious example is if the protagonist's goal requires them to break the law, but you can use other things too: limitations of magic, social norms and expectations, gender roles. The landscape itself can become a physical barrier, or the weather, or a lack of resources. And you can use your world building to raise the stakes, to increase the tension.
Your world should be deeply and intrinsically embedded into your story and into your characters, and in turn, they should be equally embedded into your world, because your world doesn't exist separately from the people who live in it, and you should create it with those people in mind.
And there are so many aspects of your world that you can use to ramp up the conflict in your story, to increase the tension, to raise the stakes. Your characters won't always simply accept the world as it is. They will have opinions about everything: beliefs, hopes, grievances, things they love, things they hate, things they want to change, things they fight to change. And these things will differ based on all of their personal nuances. gender, age, class, religion, etc. So their opinions will be different to the person stood next to them. They may even directly oppose one another. Hooray, conflict!
World building, character, story. None of these things is independent from the others. There are countless other topics you could think about while world building, and here are just a few of them. So we've talked a bit about food and farming, but there's so much more to that. We have a podcast episode dedicated just to food. It's a huge topic.
And fun. We like food. And you've got to remember that when you're populating your world, you're not just populating it with your main cast. Whether they are named characters or not, whether you mention them or not, you have a world full of people. So things like police and law and order and crime and punishment, things like the government structure, things like education and how health is dealt with, like if you have hospitals, if you have a health service, if people have to pay for their health service or not. These are all huge things that you've got to think about and create in your world, even if they don't directly influence the main story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in some genres, you're gonna just take whatever is real in the real world, in like where you live, especially things like urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy. You know, if you are American, you probably don't need to go into great detail about like medical care, because it's just going to be what's real. But as long as you know that and you're aware of it, then maybe it'll come up, maybe it won't, but you've spared a moment to at least consider it.
And again, it depends on what genre you're actually writing, because let's face it, if you're going to be writing dystopia, you're going to have a big interest in your governmental structure, because you know, most dystopias, not all dystopias, but most dystopias are about oppressive governments, and also that will feed into things like police and law and order and crime and punishment. And also gender expectations are really, really played with in dystopian worlds as well, which is great fun. I love that.
Definitely. So this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is the tip of the iceberg. But these are a few things that you can use to get started. And thinking about one thing is naturally going to lead to thinking about something else. There's a bit of a cascade effect that happens.
Oh, yeah. We are sending you down the world building rabbit hole.
We are. So we have given you a lot to digest here. I hope you were taking notes, but we do have a way for you to work through all of this and more at a gentler pace and to dive deeper into world building. As a thank you for joining us today, we have a very special offer for you.
Yep, that's right. We are looking for writers who want to level up their world building game and join us in our brand new World Building Quest course. Doors are open now, but they will be closing in just a few days. Students will get to embark on a new kind of world building journey and work with us to create a rich and immersive world for their writing.
The skills we'll show you will help you to confidently create worlds in the future, and you'll get lifetime access to the course as it evolves. We're giving away one place on the course to a lucky viewer of this presentation. Just email us at wbquest@greatwesternwoods.com and tell us your biggest world building struggle.
And a winner will be selected at random and emailed directly on the 20th of September. You can also find out more about the course on our website, greatwesternwoods.com. You can find our podcast on all platforms and lots of information and resources on our website. We're also on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, so just look for Great Western Woods Podcast.
That's all from us for now. Thank you so much for joining us.